Hi, Hughes History students with Mr. Howe, and today we continue our YouTube lessons looking at Chapter 13, Section 3. And this is the section about the war with Mexico and about how the United States acquires the land called the Mexican Cession. We've talked a little bit about this term called manifest destiny. Manifest means obvious, destiny means your future. So when they talk about manifest destiny, they're talking about it was the obvious future of the United States to expand. Even though we're going to look at this more in depth when we go over the section, inside of the section for Chapter 13, Section 1, in a Voice from the Past section, it's going to have the actual newspaper writer who invented the term manifest destiny, and he'll be quoted in here, and it says, "Our manifest destiny is to overspread and possess the whole of the continent which Providence," meaning God, "has given us for the development of the great experiment of liberty and self-government." In other words, what John O'Sullivan was saying, and many Americans agreed with him, that it was God's design that the United States was going to expand from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific. Well, whether or not it was God's plan is debatable, but it's not debatable that expansion took place. Before we get into the lesson, though, I'd like you to take a look at some of the goals and objectives and what I call the proving behavior as I make you study this chapter in this section. So here we have the main objective for Chapter 13, Section 3, and the main objective is to demonstrate an understanding of how the United States fulfilled the idea of manifest destiny and expanded westward to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific coast. The proving behavior is that after you watch this video, I'd like you to go to School Loop and click on the assignment, and you'll be able to see another attachment. We've already done two other attachments before this. This one's going to be a map of the results of the Mexican-American War. So make sure you can find that and print that out, because that's going to be how I'm going to have an idea. Do you really understand what we're teaching today, along with the section assessment? Why it matters today? Well, 1/3 of all Americans live in the areas that were added to the United States in 1848 from the war with Mexico. So we're talking about a huge chunk of land, second only to the Louisiana Purchase in terms of the amount of land that was added to the United States as a result of this war with Mexico. And how about the connection to today? Many Americans today are descendants of the Mexican settlers who inhabited the western area taken from Mexico. The culture of the West has many Hispanic influences. Look at all the place names that have Spanish place names. And the fact that we're still, arguing about illegal immigration from the United States and Mexico and crossing the border and who's going to be allowed to cross that border. And you have President Trump saying, "Build that wall." So, this is all part of that story, part of that history that explains why immigration from the United States to Mexico, as it happened in Texas, and also today how immigration from Mexico into the United States is still a big and hotly debated topic. Let's go ahead and now let's take a look at the map that I wanted you to do that went along with the last section, the one about Texas, so you can correct your map and make sure you have everything that you need to have on it. Okay, so here's the map that was due. It was due on May 1st, but if you haven't got it done, you can still get it in and still get credit for this. Lots of information. This is about Texas. You should recognize some of the names. Stephen Austin, and that one you had to write in there. The arrows are meant to kind of show immigration from the United States. It didn't do a lot of battles, just kind of showed the Alamo, it showed Goliad, and it showed San Jacinto. But probably the most important thing that might keep you from getting full credit, there's a couple of dates you have to remember. You had to write down somewhere on the map, 1834, Santa Anna makes himself dictator of Mexico. 1821, Mexico wins its independence from Spain and welcomes the Americans to Texas. And then inside the box are what happens after the fighting ends, how in 1836 Texas gained its independence from Mexico. and becomes the Lone Star Republic. Sam Houston is elected president. That same year, Congress turns down the application, the request for Texas to be admitted to the Union, mostly based upon Northerners afraid of adding another slave state and giving the slave states more power in the Senate. In 1845, Congress decides to let Texas become the state. So there's that period of 9 years where Texas is its own separate country, has a president, has ambassadors. 9 years they were the Lone Star Republic, not the Lone Star State that they call themselves today, the Lone Star Republic, because they were a separate country. And then in 1846, the acquisition of Texas eventually leads to the war that we're going to be studying today, the Mexican War. So before we get to the chapter, or the section, let's go ahead and take a look at that large size map so we can get an idea of what parts of the country we're talking about. So the part of the United States that we're really focusing on today is going to be the southwestern part, including Texas and our state, California. If you want to look at, if you added Texas to the land that was acquired by this war, because technically there was a lot of disputes about Texas that were settled by this war with Mexico called the Mexican-American War. But if you add all that land together, it is bigger than the Louisiana Purchase. But if you just take the land that's called the Mexican Cession, a cession is an area of land that is ceded or given. It's spelled C-E-D-E-D. Ceded from another country means it's usually given from one country to another country, either by purchase or by force or by war. And of course, this is going to be ceded by a war, and that becomes the land called the Mexican Cession that was added to the United States after the war with Mexico by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. That's one of the terms you have to read about and look up too, so I'm sure you probably already knew that. But now, let's go ahead and take a look at what Chapter 13, Section 3 has to say about this war with Mexico. Okay, so now that we've gone through some of the introductory stuff, I'm hoping that you read through the chapter and you did your section assessment, your terms and names, and your main ideas, and maybe even your critical thinking. And now's your chance to get maybe a little bit more insight into what you read and what you learned. And the section starts on page 406. And so if you go to page 406 of your textbook and you take a look at what it says there on page 406, there is a painting of James K. Polk. I think his middle name was Knox, but I'm not positive. But James K. Polk, and in that little section, it calls him a dark horse candidate, which is an interesting political term. What it has to do is that a dark horse candidate is a candidate for president who wasn't considered a president until the convention. In other words, they thought somebody else was going to win, and then some things happened, and they couldn't get enough support for that person at the convention, and so they kind of nominate someone who wasn't considered a candidate until the convention, and James K. Polk was one of those candidates. To give you an example, going into the Democratic convention coming up this summer, most everybody knows it's going to be Biden. But let's say that it wasn't clear who it was going to be, and Biden and Sanders and Warren were still kind of in the mix for who was going to be the Democratic candidate to go against Trump in the next election, but they couldn't decide. But then a fourth person kind of stepped up and said, hey, I'm a little bit like Biden, I'm a little bit like Sanders, I'm a little bit like Warren, and so that person would be called a dark horse candidate. So James K. Polk fit into that category, and that's why it mentions to him. He's also the president that gets, I don't know if you want to call it the credit or not, but is famous for being the president that added a lot of territory to the United States. You can say Jefferson is important because he was the president when they added the Louisiana Purchase. But you know, Polk was the president when they added Oregon, when they added the Mexican Cession, Texas. You could probably throw that in there too, even though technically he wasn't the president yet. But still, he's added a lot of territory to the United States. So if there is a, quote, manifest destiny, end quote, president, it's going to be Polk. In that page, it talks about how a lot of Americans supported the growth of the United States. And then in the next page, on page 407, it talks about adding Oregon. Now, the story of Oregon, I'm not going to make you do a map or anything on Oregon, but it's kind of interesting that one of Polk's campaign slogans when he was running had to do with the Oregon Territory. Oregon was jointly controlled by both the British in Canada and Americans who had moved to Oregon. But Polk argued that if you elect me president, if they don't give us all of Oregon, then we're going to go to war with Great Britain again. So imagine that, if they had gone to war with Great Britain over Oregon a third time, the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and now a third war with Great Britain over Oregon. But luckily, the cooler heads prevailed, and they were able to take the Oregon Territory and divide it using a line of latitude. I think it was the 46th degree line, or no, so the 49th degree line of latitude. And so the northern half became part of Canada, and is today like where you would find places in Canada called Vancouver. And then everything south of the 49th line became American Oregon. And from that Oregon Territory, not just Oregon, but Washington, Oregon, parts of Idaho were all added to the United States as a result of that compromise, that treaty negotiations with the British. So it talks about that in that section. But the most important part of the section, in my opinion, is where it talks about the troubles with Mexico. So as you were reading this, you came across the Nueces River and the dispute with Mexico over whether the Nueces River is the border with Mexico, between Mexico and Texas, or is it the Rio Grande. And in that next page, on page 408, it talks about how Polk really wanted California. And so he sent an ambassador to Mexico to offer $25 million for California and New Mexico and to solve the dispute with Texas. And Mexico just laughed. They said, "Are you out of your mind? It's worth so much more than $25 million," and rejected his $25 million offer. So Polk knew that he needed a reason to go to war. So basically, in the story it tells you, he manufactured a reason to go to war with Mexico by telling a general to put troops in disputed territory. And that kind of forced Mexico to respond with force. And after Mexico responded with force, that gave Polk the idea of saying, well, Mexico has invaded our territory. Was it really their territory? Questionable. And shed American blood upon American soil. Well, was it really American soil? Very questionable. But that was the excuse they needed. He asks Congress for a declaration of war, and Congress declares war on Mexico, creating this war. In some books it's called the Mexican War. In some books it's called the Mexican-American War. I'm trying to think of, in Mexican textbooks, they have a very interesting name for it. But I'll have to think about it. Maybe it'll come to me. But they don't call it the Mexican-American War. I think they call it the American War of Intervention or something like that, to kind of make the United States the aggressor, which, in truth, I think you can say they were. In that same little paragraph, it talks about how Abraham Lincoln, who was still just kind of a relatively unknown member of the House of Representatives from Illinois, how he raises questions about this war. Is this really a good idea to go to war just to gain territory, and questions whether or not the blood was shed on American soil or not. And there were a lot of Americans that were not for this war, and we'll talk about some of those issues at the end of the lesson today. But the war does start, and there's a map on page 408. One of the things I'm going to ask you to do later on today, after you finish this lesson and finish your section assessment, is to print out an attachment that just kind of goes over some of the basic things of this war with Mexico. So that the map on page 408, I think, will be especially helpful to you. So don't forget that there's a map. Also, I'd like you to pay special attention to a photograph of the first California flag that was made by Americans. If you take a look at the bear, it's not a very good representation of the bear, but this, if you've ever seen the California state flag, now you know where it comes from. It starts as this flag with a bear and a red star and the words California Republic, because for a few months California was actually a separate country, not part of Mexico, not part of the United States. They announced themselves as a separate country, similar to Texas. But instead of having to wait 9 years to become a state, California becomes a state very quickly. So remember with this map, if you go on to page 409, it has a voice from the past showing that some people really saw this as a war to expand slavery. We haven't talked much about Frederick Douglass. He's going to be in the next chapter that we study and talk about. But Frederick Douglass was a free African that had been a slave and escaped from slavery and becomes probably the most famous black American of his time as an abolitionist. To be an abolitionist meant that you wanted to abolish slavery, and Frederick Douglass, being an escaped slave, was one of the most vocal supporters of abolishing slavery. And if you read that voice from the past, he says, "The determination of our slave-holding president," and it's true, Polk was a slave owner, "to prosecute the war and the probability of his success in wringing from the people men and money to carry it on is made evident. None seem willing to take their stand for peace at all risks, and all seem willing that the war should be carried on in some form or other." Kind of showing he was very suspicious if really this war was fought because American blood had been spilled on American soil, as Polk said in his message to Congress. So the war starts, and in this section it talks about the Bear Flag Revolt in California. It talks about Stephen Kearny being one of the generals, or maybe not a general, but a leader that goes all the way to Santa Fe, New Mexico, takes control, occupies Santa Fe, then eventually goes all the way to California to help the white Californians take control of California from Mexico as well. And then on page 409 at the bottom, oh, before we move on, there's a kind of a strange but true section. I advise you to read that because it's kind of crazy when you read about in an earlier conflict in 1842 that the leader of Mexico, still Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, he lost a leg in a battle he fought with the French earlier before this war starts, and because they had to amputate his leg, he actually had a separate burial for his leg. And it's a funny story about how some people how they act about that, kind of interesting. Then it talks about how Zachary Taylor battles from Texas and takes control of northern Mexico. General Winfield Scott by sea arrives with the Navy and the Marines and arrives at Veracruz, and eventually the Marines and the Army fight their way all the way and occupy Mexico City. That's an interesting part of this war that we think about. It wasn't just fought on the fringes of Mexico, on the outside borders of Mexico. American troops actually fought all the way to Mexico City and occupied Mexico City. So that's kind of a, that had to be pretty tough. I mean, imagine how the United States felt when the British occupied and burnt Washington, D.C. during the War of 1812. You can only imagine how the people of Mexico felt when their capital was taken over and occupied by General Winfield Scott and the U.S. Marines and the U.S. Army. So very quickly, though, they realized they better get a peace treaty out of this, because the Mexican people, even though the army had been defeated, the people started fighting a what would today be called a guerrilla war against the United States forces. You know, the people hadn't necessarily totally given up. So the United States realized if they were going to get anything out of this, they'd better get a treaty fast. And they do. Within a couple of months of occupying Mexico City, they forced the Mexican leadership to sign a treaty called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And as part of that treaty, you can see a map right below that part on page 410 where it shows that yellow area called the Mexican Cession that was acquired as a result of the Guadalupe Hidalgo. You can generally also, I usually lump Texas in with that too, because that was still disputed as well, but it's kind of showing a kind of a difference between the Texas annexation and the Mexican Cession. And then also notice that right below that yellow section showing the Mexican Cession, it has kind of a salmon color showing something that happened about 5 years later, a purchase called the Gadsden Purchase. And that involved, I think, $10 million that the United States paid to Mexico for that little piece of land there so that they could build or have an area that was flatter to build a transcontinental railroad that would stretch from Texas all the way to California. And I think that's interesting because in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, they tried to make it look like, well, we're not just taking your land, we're giving you money. They gave $15 million for the entire southwest part of the United States, including California. 5 years later, they were willing to give $10 million just for that little sliver of land called the Gadsden Purchase. And that kind of completes all the land that is in the continental United States as far as, you know, the 48 states that are all connected to each other. They call that contiguous states. Later on, of course, they add Hawaii, they add Alaska, and who knows, maybe in the next 5 years, Puerto Rico may become the 51st state. But anyway, the Gadsden Purchase in 1853 was the last land acquisition of the 48 states that are all contiguous or connected together. Then on page 411, it just kind of, I'd like you to take a look at that now and then section because it talks about how we're still arguing about Mexican land rights. One of the things that happens as white Americans move west is that they claim land that was already owned by Mexicans when the land was under Mexico. Well, now these, as soon as the United States takes over the land, they become not Mexicans so much as Mexican Americans. And supposedly there were laws that were passed to protect their land ownership. But unfortunately, a lot of white Americans moved into a lot of this land, claimed it as theirs and said, no, this is our land, it's not the Mexican Americans' land. When the Mexican Americans would challenge that and take it to court, because all of the courts were dominated by white judges, most of the time the white Americans won the land and Mexican Americans lost a lot of land. And in this now and then section on page 411, it shows you that they're still challenging this, that people are taking their land grant contracts to court still today, and a lot of the Mexican Americans are winning based on this kind of new attitude about, well, let's do the right thing about this and not base everything on race. So at the very end of this page, you get to the terms and names and the using graphics. And once again, you don't have to do the using graphics because we're going to do it together. And you have to explain the significance of, looks like 7 terms, 3 main ideas, and hopefully you're brave enough to try the critical thinking. So hopefully you've had a chance to do all that, and now we're going to take a moment and go over all of the terms and names, have you add the using graphics, and because that's my evidence that you watched this video, and then go over the main idea questions and the critical thinking questions. Okay, so now that we've gone over the chapter and you've had a chance to do all your terms and names and your main ideas, and hopefully you challenged yourself and did the critical thinking question, let's go over some of the answers. Once again, here's your opportunity to fix, change, make better your answer. Feel free to pause at any point. If there's anything on the terms and names that you don't have that's correct, you can fix it, you can add to it. So once again, we get this term, manifest destiny. It's the belief that the United States would expand across the continent. Manifest means obvious, destiny means your future, so it was the obvious future that the United States was going to expand. And it's a very exciting idea. We think about people moving west, and going west has become kind of like a metaphor for a fresh start, a new start, and that's a positive thing about manifest destiny. But don't forget that manifest destiny is also connected to the issues of slavery. It's also connected to the issue of racism, as people moved west and disregarded the land of the Native Americans and of many of the Mexicans who had held that land since the Spanish conquest before that. James K. Polk, the 11th President of the United States, known as being the president of Manifest Destiny, the one that started the war with Mexico to get all that land. Even though it didn't happen during his presidency, he's also credited with inspiring the acquisition of Texas. It happened actually during Tyler's presidency, before Polk became president, but after the election had already been decided and Polk was going to be the president. Zachary Taylor, who's a famous general that, following the pattern of Washington and Jackson, eventually becomes a president because of his fame in the Mexican-American War. The Bear Flag Revolt, we've talked about that in the reading about California. It kind of explains why there's a big grizzly bear on our state flag. Winfield Scott, another general from the war. Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is the name of the treaty that ended the war with Mexico, gave us California and all the Southwest in exchange for about $15 million. We talked about that. And the term the Mexican Cession, a vast region given up by Mexico to the United States after the war with Mexico. So once again, if your terms and names don't match with these, pause here, fix it, correct it, make it right. Next is the required timeline that you have to have. That is my evidence that you actually looked at this video and learned a little bit from it. And the timeline starts with the events. Some of the events were already typed in for you. So make sure at this point now you pause the video and you write down these events that show some of the big events of the Mexican-American War. So event number 1 would be Zachary Taylor stations troops on the northern bank of the Rio Grande. That happened in April of 1846. February 1847, the U.S. troops win a big battle called the Battle of Buena Vista and control northern Mexico. Event number 3, a good thing to write down, would be that in California, the Americans who were already there rebel against Mexico, declare independence from Mexico. Kind of like Texas, there's a period of time where California actually declared itself to be a separate country, but very quickly they realized that it was going to be a state. So it didn't last as long as the 9 years that Texas was its own country. But for a couple of months, California can say that, hey, California was its own country. September 1847 is when the American forces actually occupy Mexico City and end the organized fighting. And then finally, kind of quickly, that should say 1848, by the way, not 1847, February 1847. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is signed by Mexico, giving up all that land in exchange for $15 million. So this has to be on your section assessment when you turn it into me. So pause right now and make sure you copy down this little timeline of events. But let's go ahead and fix that one so you don't do it wrong here. 1848. There we go. Okay, and now we get to the main ideas and for the extension question about critical thinking. So the first question on there is how it talked about, and we went over this when we looked at the book, but Oregon is also part of Manifest Destiny, even though it wasn't something that is part of the map or anything I'm going to ask you to do. But how do the acquisitions of Oregon and the Mexican Cession relate to the idea of manifest destiny? And a good answer would be many Americans believed that it was the obvious future, that's what manifest destiny means, of the U.S. to expand all the way to the Pacific, even when the land was occupied or claimed by another country. Acquiring Oregon from the British and taking the Mexican Cession through a war with Mexico fulfilled that destiny. So pause right here and check your answer. Make sure you got the right answer. If there's something you'd like to add, you can add to it. And now let's take a look at letter B. Why were some people opposed to the war with Mexico? Well, here's a good answer. Some leaders felt that President Polk was instigating a war just to take land from a weaker country, and that was morally wrong. We know that Abraham Lincoln questioned it, among others. Others believed that there was a conspiracy of slave state leaders that wanted to take the land from Mexico in order to expand slavery and slave state power in Congress. So there were some people, especially Northerners, who were against the war with Mexico, either on moral grounds or, the idea of fighting a war is just not for land is not just a moral thing. And then the idea that many Northerners felt that the Southerners were instigating this war, pushing this war so that they could get more land for slave states. So pause it right here if you want to add something to your section assessment. Then you get to letter C, where it says, what does the phrase sea to shining sea mean? You've probably heard that in patriotic songs and things like that. It means that the U.S. occupation of land from the Atlantic, where the country started, to the Pacific, where it stretched to in 1848. Many believed in early and mid-1800s that it was the manifest destiny, the obvious future of the U.S. to expand from sea to shining sea, no matter what country or group got in the way. And we like to think of ourselves as a strong country, a powerful country, but don't forget that manifest destiny also has to do with disregarding the rights of the Native Americans who had claimed the land originally. It disregarded the rights that Mexico claimed that they had to the land. So there is, manifest destiny is kind of generally a positive thing, but it's also kind of tinged with racism. And also, don't forget, tinged with slavery, because many people thought that this was another attempt just to get land away from Mexico to have more slave states. So pause here if you need to add something to your section assessment. And finally, you get to the critical thinking question. And it talks about compare the different ways that land was acquired by the United States in the period of manifest destiny from 1844 to 1853. And take a look at your answer if you want to add to it. And, even if you want to copy this one down and say, hey, I didn't think about this, but yeah, I think these are some things to think about. From the perspective of the Native Americans, all the land of the West was taken by war and occupation. However, leaving Native American claims aside, the Oregon Territory was obtained by a treaty or agreement with Great Britain. Texas and the Mexican Cession was taken by war or aggression. The Gadsden Purchase from Mexico was a land purchase in order to build a railroad through more accessible territory. So when you think about the ways that the United States acquired territory, war and occupation are the most or happen the most. There were land purchases, including the Louisiana Purchase. And then also there was land agreements by treaty, such as the ones that were made with Great Britain, that gave the United States what we call the Oregon Territory, mostly the states of Oregon, Washington, and parts of Idaho. So what can we say about the war with Mexico and this idea of manifest destiny, of expanding all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific? Going to war is supposed to be something of a last resort, and yet we've studied that in this war, the leadership of the United States decided to push Mexico into a war because they wouldn't sell the Southwest Territory in California. So this is definitely, one historian called this war the most aggressive war in American history, that because Mexico wouldn't sell us the land that we wanted, we kind of bullied or instigated Mexico into a war that we were pretty sure we could win. And then we're able to take the land from Mexico that they wouldn't sell to us. is it worth it? Was it worth it back in the day? I mean, they estimate that 38,000 American soldiers, Mexican soldiers, and Mexican civilians died during this war. So there's a lot of questions about that. What about the Mexican Americans who lost land? You know, they're in California, for example, they were landowners who had land grants that some went back to the early Spanish. But now, when the war's over and they're no longer Mexicans, they're Mexican Americans, a lot of those land agreements were disregarded as white Americans moved west, challenged the old land grants, and because the courts were dominated by white Americans were able to take away the land of Mexican Americans who had had that land for centuries. Even at the time, a lot of Americans argued against the war on moral grounds. You know, was it right to use war as a way to get land and to get natural resources? We know that Abraham Lincoln, who was at the time just a member of the House of Representatives, argued against the war, or at least questioned the war on moral grounds. We know that U.S. Grant, who later becomes a big Civil War general and the 18th President of the United States, but who also fought in the Mexican-American War, later said the war was one of the most unfair wars ever fought for the most unfair of reasons. So even people at the time realized that the Mexican-American War was not probably a very moral or ethical war to fight. You know, the United States is supposed to be the good guy. We study the United States and we want to be patriotic, and in a lot of cases we can point out a lot of positive things in American history. This might be one of the questionable. It's hard to explain to students how the United States could use its military power just for the idea of taking away someone's land and getting their natural resources. If that happens today, the United States is usually the first in line protesting and maybe even organizing some type of resistance when another country tries to take away another country's land just for their natural resources. One that comes to mind very quickly is the Persian Gulf conflict. I know you guys weren't alive because it happened in the early 1990s. But in the early 1990s, the former dictator of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, decided that he wanted to take away the land of a neighboring country called Kuwait. And he sent his army and very quickly took over parts of Kuwait. The United States protested that vehemently and went right after Iraq and said, hey, if you don't back up, then we're going to organize a resistance and invade Iraq and force you to leave Kuwait. One of the interesting things that dictator Saddam Hussein said when he's challenged by the United States, he says, I don't know why the United States is so upset about this. We're only doing to Kuwait what they did to Mexico back in the 1840s. So it's hard to explain. And the only explanation, it may not be the best explanation, but one of the explanations is World War II. Because World War II changes the rules. Before World War II, if you were big enough and strong enough, there was really nothing stopping you from attacking a weaker country and taking away their land and territory, except for just basic ideas of right and wrong. But because of all the destruction and all the death that was caused by World War II, the United States makes a commitment after that war that the borders of the world need to be respected. And to keep wars like World War II from happening again, that's why they formed the United Nations and created stronger international laws that protect the sovereignty and the borders of countries around the world. So once again, after World War II, the rules are different. Before World War II, once again, if you were big enough, strong enough, you can do whatever you wanted to do, and there was really nothing there to stop you. But today, because of the stronger international rules, the United Nations and things like that, it's not supposed to happen. Anyway, that's our story for chapter 13, section 3, and I'm sticking to it. Make sure you subscribe and ring that bell.